Have you ever found yourself saying to the Lord, Lord, I love you and want to thank you for all you've done for me. And I want to do your will, Lord. I'll do anything you ask of me. As long as it's not this, that, or the other thing. I think a lot of us have probably had that experience. I know I've prayed something similar at times myself. And what are the thises, that's, and the other things we fear God will ask of us? Some might be afraid that God will want them to sell everything and become a missionary to the sub-Saharan parts of Africa. Others may imagine that God will ask them to become a cloistered nun, a monk, or a hermit. And while some are indeed privileged to be missionaries or blessed with a religious vocation or called to the consecrated life, for many, the things we don't want God to ask of us are much more mundane, much more pedestrian, even selfish. Lord, I'll be a witness for you, but just don't make me have to talk to anyone about my faith. After all, God, even St. Francis said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words, right? Well, as a matter of fact, neither St. Francis nor any of his disciples said any such thing. No leader in the Franciscan order has ever claimed St. Francis said that. It was something that was simply attributed to St. Francis, and it stuck, thus far defying all attempts at correction. And even if St. Francis had said it, which he didn't, it doesn't make any sense. Preaching and living the gospel has always been a both and, not an either or. Our words and deeds both need to preach the gospel. But my purpose tonight is not to correct the historical record. Rather, the purported quote from St. Francis merely serves as a convenient excuse for those I would call timid Catholics. They're perfectly comfortable with the Catholic faith when at Mass or with another group of Catholics, perhaps, but they remain silent or apologize for their faith when they have occasion to witness to it in a public way. All of us have likely been tempted to succumb to timidity at some time or another. And this brings me to my main purpose tonight, to say that we can't afford to do that anymore. As a church, we can't afford to be Catholics who merely trot out our faith and parade it in front of everyone at Sunday Mass and then be silent about it for the rest of the week. And why not? Well, first off, that's not what Christianity is all about. That's not really practicing the faith at all. For our faith is by its very nature evangelical. By its very nature, it is to permeate every aspect of our lives every single day. To do otherwise would be like someone going to medical school, becoming a doctor, and yet never seeing any patients. That could hardly be called practicing medicine. It would be more properly called playing doctor. But the more immediate reason why we can no longer afford to be timid is because the world in general, and our society in particular, is changing and not for the better. 70 years ago, Christianity was celebrated in this country. About 15 years ago, I would say, we reached a point where Christianity, from a societal and political standpoint, had fallen culturally to respectable but optional. And in the last few years, even that is no longer true. From a societal standpoint, Christianity is now only tolerated, if not expressed publicly. And it likely won't be long until Christians are openly persecuted on a broad scale, much like they're being persecuted individually in the United States every day, through lawsuits against Christian businesses as well as infringement against our First Amendment rights to publicly express the tenets of our faith and to publicly practice our faith. In 2014, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, who died the next year in 2015, wrote an insightful and prophetic article entitled "A Tale of Two Churches." If you Google that title, you'll find the article on the internet. In it, he relates how, among other things, the U.S. has from its founding been somewhat hostile to the Catholic Church. And the Cardinal provides a short history lesson that will help us put our current situation in perspective. So I'm going to read an extended quote from his article. Referring to the late 1700s, after we had just become a country, Cardinal George writes, quote, "The Church knew that it was far from socially acceptable in this new country. In fact, early in our history, the Church was known as America's greatest enemy. Forms of anti-Catholicism were part of its social DNA. But the government had never explicitly taken upon itself the mantle of a religion and never officially told its citizens what they must personally think or what values they must personalize in order to deserve to be part of this country until recent years." Still quoting Cardinal George, "In recent years, society has brought social and legislative approval to all types of sexual relationships that used to be considered sinful. Since the biblical vision of what it means to be human tells us that not every friendship or love can be expressed in sexual relations, the Church's teaching on these issues is now evidence of intolerance for what the civil law upholds and even imposes. What was once a request to live and let live has now become a demand for approval. The ruling class, those who shape public opinion in politics, in education, in communications, in entertainment, is using the civil law to impose its own form of morality on everyone. We are told that even in marriage itself, there is no difference between men and women, although nature and our very bodies clearly evidence that men and women are not interchangeable at will in forming a family. Nevertheless, those who do not conform to the official religion, we are warned, place their citizenship in danger." The Huffington Post on June 30th, 2014, raised concerns about the compatibility of being a Catholic and being a good citizen. This is in 2014. This is not the voice of the nativists who first fought against Catholic immigration in the 1830s, nor is it the voice of those who burned convents and churches in Boston and Philadelphia a decade later in the 1840s. Neither is it the voice of the Know-Nothing Party of the 1840s and 50s, nor of the Ku Klux Klan, which burned crosses before Catholic churches in the Midwest after the Civil War. It's the voice of a more sophisticated than that. It's a voice more sophisticated than that of the American Protective Association, whose members promise never to vote for a Catholic for public office. This is rather the self-righteous voice of some members of the American establishment today who regard themselves as progressive and enlightened. The inevitable result is a crisis of belief for many Catholics. Throughout history, when Catholics and other believers in revealed religions have been forced to choose between being taught by God or instructed by politicians, professors, editors of major newspapers, and entertainers, Many have opted to go along with the powers that be. This reduces a great tension in their lives, although it also brings with it the worship of a false god. It takes no moral courage to conform to government and societal pressure. It takes deep faith to swim against the tide, as Pope Francis encouraged young people to do at then the last summer's World Youth Day. Unquote. You know, Catholicism has always been an evangelical faith, has always called each individual Catholic to live out their faith, to proclaim the gospel in word and deed. And now we live in a time where the call to live out our faith can no longer be treated as some ideal, as an inspiring message we hear at Mass and can forget without consequence for the rest of the week. Publicly living out our faith has become an imperative, a demand, a command, if you will, if we want to be part of Christianity surviving in today's America. In the final paragraph of his article, Cardinal George wrote, quote, "Catholics do know with the certainty of faith that when Christ returns in glory to judge the living and the dead, the Church in some recognizable shape or form that is both Catholic and apostolic will be there to meet him. There is no such divine guarantee for any country, culture, or society of this or any age." Unquote. Sadly, if American Catholics, if you and I continue down the path of timidity and moral cowardice, we can be sure that our Lord will not find that recognizable form of Catholic and apostolic churches in the United States when he returns.